G'day guys, this is just a really quick one on Novavax spikes. There's a bit of confusion out there, a lot of people talking about the Novavax. Remember how I described it, that it's got a raft, a nanolipid raft where you've basically got all the spikes stuck on it. Now, the thing you have to remember, that has no replication. So it's not like the mRNAs, DNA ones, or the viral vectors, which is the adenovirus ones, okay? That have got mRNA equipment. That means you've got a deactivated adenovirus with the mRNA equipment and the spike, which comes from COVID, which then basically gets into the cell and replicates. The other one basically is in a lipid, like the Pfizer, the Moderna, in a lipid nanoparticle inside, which means it can get into the cell very easy and then use the replication systems. One thing we don't know is how long they sort of last, how much they can evade the immune system, all these sort of things. There's a lot of question marks on a lot of these sort of things, how they can embed within cells. Normally, vaccines should be basically trialed and tested over 7 years. That's the traditional way to determine whether a vaccine is safe or not. So that method. Then you can apply, once you've actually tried that, then you can create different, like we did with the flu vax. Every year we don't have to go back and do the whole 7-year thing because we use the same methods. The only difference is we just change the protein for the strain for that year, or the previous year. That's the most closest matching protein structures that haven't mutated too much over that subsequent year. And that's the whole process. The majority of the stuff out there, we're talking about 1 year. Yes, they've done a whole lot of animal trials. Yes, they've done a whole lot of trials, but at the end of the day, they still aren't, even the Novavax, it still basically isn't tested over 7 years to basically make sure that there is nothing potentially. I personally think that looking at the way it's been constructed, the way even the proteins have got these, the receptor has actually got these amino acids, the proline amino acids to sort of prevent sort of this interaction with the cell and stuff like that. And remember, you're talking about a very small amount. So even the nanoparticles that are part of some of these vaccines that people talk about, some of the nanoparticles and all that, the graphene type stuff and all that. And I'm not talking about specifically, I'm talking about some of the others like the Pfizer, the Moderna and all that. There's a lot of issues about the nanoparticles and stuff like that. As I've said, where I think the problem lies with these things is it's more the autoimmune things or all these other problematic there, the modification to the red blood cells and all these sort of other things. Something that happens also due to COVID can do these things. These you can actually get this what is called long COVID. Whether you get COVID, you could have long COVID, and also if you basically take some of these like the Pfizer, the AstraZeneca, the and Moderna and things that are either viral vector or mRNA or a DNA type. Now, whether they're any one of these, they have replication systems and all that. They tend to proliferate a lot of spikes. And in particular in people that are vitamin D deficient, which is large parts of the population, you've got a problem that until the immune system can respond, you can get a lot of excessive spike generating, so even though the initial injection site, and remember, we're talking about even the graphene, the nanoparticles, very little. We're talking about the only studies that I've seen in rats, you had to basically give them something like 3 milligrams to get to the sort of where it stayed in their system up to 6 months, these until the detox systems could clear it out. Now, when you're actually basically talking about the quantity that's actually in these vaccines is so small, it's the equivalent of the actual weight of some of the DNA nucleides. You know, very small weight, very small mass. So basically, our system can clear it out very fast. Even faster than you can clear out some heavy metals or other stuff like that. Really, so it's a non-issue, basically, even from those. I criticize those vaccines for other reasons, not for the nanoparticles. Our bodies, remember, these are carbon-based, the body can pull apart carbon-based stuff. We're made of carbon, the plants, everything's made of carbon. So let's not get to the ridiculous level. The body can pull these things apart and detox them and get rid of them. So it's a non-issue in that regard. My concern isn't these nanoparticles. That's just that's just for crackpots. My issue is about the replication and these all sorts of related issues that potentially down the track, and also because it can replicate and all that, it can actually have distorting effects even to to a number of the immune cells. It can actually have a distorting effect to red blood cells, and they seem not to basically, even when you clear out you get these sort of long COVID type symptoms or symptomatology, which you can get from actually getting the disease, but also from these viral vector mRNA types. And so that's another issue in itself. I'm going to discuss in a different video. I'm going to do something about that. But key thing, the take-home message is that first of all, it's not in a lipid particle, so it can't get into the cell. So it's basically a localized thing. You're just injecting it into your shoulder. It's a localized thing. Yes, it has all these spikes, but remember the spikes have also got little caps, the prolines, so they can't react. So even if, let's say, a nurse doesn't actually inject you properly and injects a couple of that stuff, some of that stuff into your bloodstream, not going to be an issue because it can't actually get into any cell, can't do anything. And it's such a small quantity because it doesn't have any replication systems to replicate, it will be cleared out of the system. So it's a non-issue. And as I've said, at the end of the day, the best way to guarantee that your immune system, whether you get COVID or whether you basically use Novavax, you still have to have a good vitamin D status. That's important. Either one, if you're basically going to get the Novavax because you need to, because to travel or for work or for whatever, or you're potentially going to at some point get COVID anyway, you need to maintain a good vitamin D status because that vitamin D will regulate the immune system properly. And by regulating the immune system properly, it means you'll get lifetime protection, but at the same time, you won't get any severe effects of any sort. And also, the biggest problem that I see with the mRNAs and the viral vector ones, all those, is that most people are vitamin D deficient. The damn thing replicates and actually ends up creating a big actual spike load in the system, in the body, and seems to basically endemically, until the immune system actually starts responding and starts creating a sort of an innate sort of template so it knows how to recognize and create antibodies and all that, because of the lack of vitamin D to regulate and actually have the immune system respond quick enough in the early stages. I think that these, whether you get the actual disease or you take one of these replicating type vaccines, you will tend to be more susceptible in a low vitamin D status to what they call long COVID. symptoms or syndrome, or, people call it different ways. So I think ultimately the Novavax issue about the spikes is irrelevant. It's just a joke. One thing, those prolines, those, amino acids are not going to allow any reactivity. And the good thing about it is, because it has a lot of spikes on it, it actually means that the immune, one, it's a small quantity. It's not replicating, so it's not increasing. Whatever goes in, that's it. You don't get any more. It's not like the replication, all the other ones, which will replicate and create a much bigger spike load. That's it. It's a very small spike load. It's localized, and basically the immune system actually, with the adjunct, it actually sort of preps it a bit more. It creates a bigger sort of localized response, which means it's exactly what other vaccines do. They create a localized response, which the immune system rushes into that localized area and inflames the area and all that, because that's a normal thing. You need to get an inflammation response, a localized one. The immune system then deals with it and then basically acquires innate immunity over, for your lifetime, as long as, and because we know COVID, like SARS-1, does not mutate very much, you will end up with more or less lifetime immunity. You may get different variants, but you're not going to get different strains. We haven't seen one different strain. It's not like the flu, which has got multiple strains and tends to mutate far more in that regard. So take-home message is, if you've got good vitamin D status, your symptoms of COVID will be a blip. If you need to hold on to a job or travel or stuff like that, Novavax is probably a very important thing. But in this sort of climate, I tend to generally recommend to people maintain a 5,000 IUs of vitamin D, generally. Even my friend asked me, what do you do, Harry? And I had to admit, I can't recommend it. But I personally take 10,000 every day. Okay. But I do balance that with sufficient retinol from eggs, liver, and stuff like that through the week. So I do balance it, in my own way, so I don't create any imbalances. But usually I recommend 5,000. And the reason for that is because most people on a general carnivore diet, without going out of their way of eating organ meats and other things, they will should basically have a good balance between vitamin A and vitamin D. And that's why I usually recommend that. But what I personally do, and that is my personal thing that I do, is I usually take about 10,000. If I've basically got, let's say, a bit of a sniffle or stuff like that, I may have a little cold. On that, I may, for the first 2 days, I'll take 50,000 IUs, and then I'll drop down for the next 3 days to 20,000, and then I'll go back to 10,000 IUs in this COVID climate. Generally speaking, I did not supplement in the past. I just used to go to the tropics and get my vitamin D boost in the middle of the winter. If generally this was not a COVID environment, I would generally stick to about 5,000 IUs. Because why? Because if I got the flu or if I got some viral cold, that's probably more than enough. Yeah, maybe I get a sniffle, but I'm not going to be too concerned about those things. But COVID seems to be a bit more risque compared to some of the other colds and stuff like that. So I tend to go slightly higher. I can't recommend. That's not a recommendation. That's a thing that I personally do. Whether you wish to do the same thing and up slightly your retinol to balance those two things out, well, that's up to you. I'll leave that up to you. I don't, I just provide information, and how you apply that, you do it at your own risk. Anyway, so pretty much when it comes to basically all this nonsense about, Novavax has got all these additional spikes. It's got multiple spikes on a lipid raft. Yeah, it does. But that's a good thing, because it's localized. It doesn't replicate. It doesn't grow any large amounts. And you know what? It gets a quick, immediate response. That's why people usually feel a bit of soreness and an immediate response when they get vaccinated, which is exactly what you want. You want the immune system to jump on it, eliminate it, and basically get immunity. That's the whole thing. That's what traditional vaccines do. We don't want these ones that you put them and you hardly feel it. It's going away and replicating in your cells and all that, more like the actual virus does. Do you know what I mean? So that's the difference. You don't notice when you get infected. You don't get this because it basically tries to circumvent your immune system. And what these things are doing, the mRNA, the DNA, and the viral vector is doing the same thing. So, with a low vitamin D status, a lot of the population, is that the wise way to go? Because you have the potential, whether you get the disease or use one of these methods, potentially to create in a low vitamin D status population, long COVID type syndrome symptoms. I don't think, we're going to look back at this and say, I think we made the wrong choices in that regard. But I'll leave that for history to basically, to deal with it. All I can do is I can give you an unbiased, based on science, opinion on what I think is the potential risks with those things. It's not medical advice. This is Harry's opinion, personal opinion on what I think the risks are. I've actually elaborated them out in a number of other videos. I'm not going to go over old ground. People can go and check up the other videos. It was just basically to cover this point about the spikes that a lot of people are talking about, just to basically get it out of your head. It's not an issue. It's the least problematic, If basically somebody was to say, do you want to have a good vitamin D status and have COVID, or do you want to take Novavax and have a good vitamin D status? I know which one I would go, which one would be the safest option, the Novavax, over actually getting it in that regard. The only reason why, as I said, why you may want to get the actual COVID over the Novavax is the following. It's for long-term immunity. Because obviously the virus itself, it's not only the spike, it's all these other proteins. And all these other proteins that are coming in, you're going to basically get, you could say, your immune system is going to have a much more complete template of the actual virus. So it will be able to deal with it much better if a new variant comes out in the future, way better. But as I've said, the vitamin D status is the must. Whatever you do, you've got to have good vitamin D status. But the choice which you take, whether you allow yourself to potentially get infected in the future, or you decide to take the Novavax, that's up to you, not up to me. It's up to you. You've got to be a big boy and a big girl and make your own decisions in this world. And that's the way it goes. The cookie crumbles, so to speak. I hope you understood my thinking behind all this. And if anybody's got any other questions in particular about certain subject matters relating to this, let me know. Approach me, ask me about these things. A number of people have had, and I've looked at, and I've gone back to them and said, this is what the literature says. I've looked at this. There's no issue here. Or there could be potentially, in that regard. So I back my stuff up with good science and good research. And in other areas, when I've speculated, I've said quite clearly, I'm speculating, of these potential risks because we've seen it in other applications, like in cancer research and other areas where some of these methods have been applied, viral vector, mRNA, and DNA versions of these type of vaccine type therapies that have been used in the past. And it's not what we've traditionally done in vaccines. So this technology comes from a different area where it's been applied, and it's had issues. And so that's all we're pointing out. We're pointing out those issues that have existed. And I've pointed those out. I've shown you the PubMed studies when it comes to strokes and stuff like that, and about the viral vector ones. So I've been quite clear and open and candid about these things. And the literature is there for anyone to go and search for it, you know. But the more I look at Novavax, I can't really find something to fault it. So even though we don't have the 7 years, and that's the only thing against it, against every vaccine, but generally speaking, if you don't have long-term studies to show quite clearly that something is efficacious, that there is no real problem with it, and you've actually really worked out any potential risk or any complication, even to minor groups, you've identified minor groups that may be more susceptible to something in there. I mean, even the bark, the adjunct that is actually used, that bark extract that basically creates that strong immune response. I don't know, there may be, 1 in a billion people, 1 in a billion, or, 2 in a billion people, of an extreme rarity where somebody could react negatively to that, even though it's small quantity, who knows? There's always going to be a risk with everything. Walking across the street is a risk. There's risks in life. You have to measure and you have to make your own decisions. You're big enough people, bright enough with plenty of information, especially hanging around me, Bart, and people like that, to understand that, living is a risk. So I will leave that up to you, which way you go. All I do is I present the research, the science, and my opinions are based on good research. What you do with that, it's up to you. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. See yous.